The gates of Forest Lawn Memorial Park stood silent under the California moonlight, just as they had for decades. Beyond those iron barriers, past the marble statues and beneath the flowering gardens, lay one of the most visited graves in American history. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, had been laid to rest there in September 2009, and the world had mourned. Millions of fans had left flowers, notes, and tears at the entrance, unable to get close to where their idol truly rested. But in the shadowed corners of the internet, in the whispered conversations of devoted followers, a different story had always circulated. A story that suggested something far stranger than anyone dared to believe. Detective Sarah Chen had heard the rumors throughout her 15 years on the force, but she'd never given them serious thought. Urban legends surrounded every celebrity death, especially one as shocking and controversial as Jackson's. Yet here she stood at 3 a.m, holding a court order that would change everything she thought she knew. The document trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what it represented. After years of legal battles, sealed testimonies, and evidence that had been locked away in vaults, a judge had finally granted permission for the tomb to be opened. The official reason was a fraud investigation involving the estate, but Sarah knew there was more to it than that. Beside her stood Marcus Thompson, a forensic specialist who had worked on some of the most high-profile cases in the country. His face was grave, his usual easy humor completely absent. He'd been personally requested for this assignment, pulled from a vacation in Hawaii because of his reputation for discretion and expertise. Neither of them spoke as they walked through the cemetery, flanked by security guards and estate lawyers who looked equally uncomfortable with the night's mission. The crunch of gravel under their feet seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The Jackson family had fought this moment with every resource at their disposal. Lawyers had filed motion after motion, arguing about dignity, privacy, and the sanctity of final rest. But the evidence that had emerged 6 months ago had been too compelling to ignore. A deathbed confession from one of Jackson's former bodyguards had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The man had spoken of secret meetings, of documents he'd been forced to sign, of a plan so elaborate that it had involved dozens of people sworn to absolute silence. He died 3 days after making his statement, and his words had ignited a legal firestorm that had consumed the entertainment world. Sarah remembered watching Jackson's funeral on television, remembered the golden casket and the tears of his children. She'd been moved like everyone else, swept up in the global grief that had seemed to unite the planet for one brief moment. Now, as she approached the private mausoleum where Jackson's body had been entombed, she felt a creeping sense that everything she'd witnessed might have been something else entirely. The building before them was modest by celebrity standards, a cream-colored structure with elegant columns and bronze doors that reflected the security lights. A member of the estate's legal team stepped forward with a key, his hand shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to fit it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a click that echoed like a gunshot. The doors swung inward, revealing a corridor lined with flowers that had been preserved under glass, photographs covering every surface, and at the end, a stone sarcophagus engraved with Jackson's name, birth date, and the date the world believed he'd died. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Whatever they found tonight would either put the rumors to rest forever or unleash a truth that would reshape everything the public believed about one of the most famous men who ever lived. Marcus set down his equipment case and began unpacking instruments that gleamed under the harsh portable lights they brought. DNA testing kits, cameras, measurement tools, everything needed to document whatever lay within that stone chamber. The process would take hours, every step recorded, every finding witnessed and verified. Sarah watched him work, her mind racing through the possibilities. What if the bodyguard had been telling the truth? What if the greatest performer of a generation had staged the greatest performance of all? The estate lawyers stood in a tight cluster near the entrance, whispering among themselves. They'd brought their own witnesses, their own experts, determined to ensure that whatever happened tonight couldn't be disputed or distorted. The tension in the air was suffocating. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the time and saw that it was now 4 a.m. Somewhere across Los Angeles, the city was beginning to stir, unaware that in this quiet cemetery, the truth about Michael Jackson was about to be revealed. Marcus looked up from his preparations, his face illuminated by the cold light. "We're ready," he said simply. 2 security guards moved forward with crowbars, positioning themselves at the edges of the sarcophagus lid. The scraping of metal against stone filled the chamber as they worked to break the seal. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. In moments, they would know. The lid shifted, moved, and then with a final heave, it slid aside. Everyone in the room leaned forward, and what they saw in that instant would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The collective gasp that filled the mausoleum was like a physical force. Sarah Chen felt her knees weaken as she stared into the open sarcophagus, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. The stone chamber was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. No casket, no remains, nothing but a thin layer of dust and a single white glove resting in the center, positioned as deliberately as a museum piece. Marcus Thompson pushed past the frozen security guards, his forensic instincts overriding his shock, and leaned into the opening with a flashlight. The beam swept across the interior, confirming what everyone could already see. Michael Jackson's body was not there. The estate lawyers erupted into chaos, their professional composure shattering instantly. One of them was already on his phone, barking orders to someone on the other end, his voice shrill with panic. Another had gone pale, leaning against the wall as if the strength had drained from his legs. But it was a senior attorney, a man named Harrison Blackwell who'd represented the Jackson estate for 20 years, whose reaction struck Sarah as most telling. He didn't look surprised. He looked defeated, like a man whose deepest secret had finally been exposed. She filed that observation away, her detective's mind already working through the implications. Marcus carefully photographed the empty space from every angle, his camera flash creating strobe-like bursts that made the scene feel even more surreal. He pulled on latex gloves and reached for the white glove, lifting it with tweezers and placing it into an evidence bag. Even through the protective barrier, Sarah could see it was authentic, the same style Jackson had made iconic during his performances. It had been placed there intentionally, a message or perhaps a signature. She moved closer to the sarcophagus, examining the interior walls. They were smooth, undisturbed, showing no signs of forced entry or tampering. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been a recent grave robbery. The security logs would need to be reviewed, but Sarah already suspected what they would show. This mausoleum had been sealed since the burial, monitored constantly, protected by some of the best security money could buy. The only explanation that made any sense was the one that seemed impossible. The body had never been here at all. The funeral, watched by millions, the golden casket carried by grieving family members, the entire elaborate ceremony had been theater. The greatest showman had orchestrated one final show. Harrison Blackwell ended his phone call and turned to face the group, his expensive suit somehow looking rumpled despite being perfectly pressed. "I need everyone to stop what they are doing," he announced, his voice strained. "This situation is far more complex than you understand. There are legal protections in place, agreements that were signed, and I'm invoking them now." Sarah stepped forward, her badge in hand. "Mr. Blackwell, this is an active investigation. You can invoke whatever you want, but we're not stopping until we understand what happened here." The lawyer's eyes met Hayes, and she saw something unexpected there, relief mixed with apprehension. "Detective Chen," he said quietly, glancing at the others in the room, "what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane. But I'm bound by attorney-client privilege that extends beyond death, and there's documentation that explains everything. The judge who signed your court order, he knew. He had to have known, because this was always going to lead here. The question is, are you prepared to understand why?" Marcus stopped his documentation and looked up sharply. "Are you saying you knew the body wasn't here?" Blackwell nodded slowly. "I'm saying I knew there was a possibility, yes. And I'm saying that Michael Jackson's death certificate is real, legally binding, and filed with the state of California. Everything that happened in 2009 was legitimate in the eyes of the law. But the law and the truth are sometimes two very different things." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax that bore an impression Sarah couldn't quite make out. "This was entrusted to me with specific instructions. If the tomb was ever opened and found empty, I was to reveal its contents." The other lawyers tried to protest, but Blackwell silenced them with a sharp gesture. "Gentlemen, the secrecy clause is void if the tomb is opened. That was always the agreement. Whatever happens now, it's out of our hands." He broke the seal and removed a sheaf of documents, along with several photographs and what looked like a handwritten letter. Sarah's heart raced as he spread them across a nearby bench, handling them with a reverence usually reserved for ancient artifacts. The top photograph showed Michael Jackson, but not as the world had last seen him. This was recent, or at least more recent than 2009. He looked older, his face bearing the weight of years, but unmistakably alive. The room fell silent except for the harsh breathing of the security guards who'd crowded closer to see. Marcus recovered first, his scientific mind demanding verification. That could be doctored, photoshopped. It doesn't prove anything. Blackwell nodded, which is why there are videos, biometric scans, DNA samples, and testimonies from multiple witnesses, all sealed in a vault at a location I'm not authorized to disclose. This envelope contains only an overview, a map to the real evidence. But yes, Dr. Thompson, you're right to be skeptical. That's exactly the reaction we expected. Sarah picked up the handwritten letter, recognizing Jackson's distinctive signature at the bottom from the countless autographs she'd seen in her research. The writing was shaky but legible, dated June 2009, just weeks before his reported death. She began to read aloud, her voice cutting through the tension. To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, then you have discovered the truth that I could not reveal while I lived. What I am about to explain is not an act of deception, but an act of survival. The world I inhabited became a prison, and the only way to escape was to cease to exist. The letter went on to describe a life that had become unbearable, the constant scrutiny, the invasions of privacy, the legal battles, and most disturbingly, the threats. Jackson wrote of credible danger to himself and his children, of forces that wanted to control him, exploit him, and ultimately destroy him. He consulted with experts in security, with lawyers who specialized in identity protection, and with doctors who understood the toll his fame had taken on his physical and mental health. Together, they devised a plan that seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence that they'd succeeded. Sarah looked up from the letter to find every eye in the room fixed on her. "Is alive," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "Michael Jackson is alive, and this letter says he's been living under a different identity for the past 16 years. Harrison Blackwell nodded gravely. "That's what the documentation suggests. Yes, but there's more, detective. Much more. And now that you've opened this door, you're going to have to decide what to do with the truth." The conference room at the Los Angeles Police Department had never felt so small. Sarah Chen sat at the head of the table, surrounded by files, photographs, and the weight of a secret that could destabilize the entertainment industry and shatter millions of hearts worldwide. Across from her sat Captain Raymond Torres, a man who'd seen everything in his 30-year career but now looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Beside him, Marcus Thompson was still processing DNA evidence, though they all knew what it would show. The samples from the glove matched Michael Jackson's genetic profile perfectly, but they'd been deliberately left behind, another piece of the elaborate puzzle. Harrison Blackwell had spent the past 6 hours walking them through the documentation, and each revelation had been more stunning than the last. The plan to fake Jackson's death hadn't been a sudden decision, but a carefully orchestrated operation that had taken 3 years to prepare. It had involved a network of people, each knowing only their small part of the larger picture, each bound by legal agreements so ironclad that breaking them would result in criminal prosecution and financial ruin. At the center of it all had been a man named Dr. Raymond Chandler, not a medical doctor, but an expert in identity creation who'd worked with witness protection programs and intelligence agencies. Sarah flipped through her notes, trying to organize the chaos into something coherent. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of conversation. In 2006, Jackson approached Dr. Chandler with a proposal. He wanted to disappear, to leave his life behind completely. Chandler told him it was impossible, that someone of Jackson's fame could never truly vanish. But Jackson was persistent, and he offered unlimited resources to make it happen. Blackwell nodded. "That's correct." Initially, Chandler refused. He'd worked on dozens of cases, but nothing on this scale. The logistics alone seemed insurmountable. But Jackson wouldn't take no for an answer. Captain Torres leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "So what changed Chandler's mind?" The lawyer shuffled through his papers and pulled out a transcript of an interview. In early 2007, there was an incident. Jackson received a credible death threat, not the usual fan obsession, but something organized and specific. The FBI investigated but couldn't identify the source. That's when Chandler agreed to at least explore the possibility. He assembled a team, a forensic pathologist, a Hollywood special effects artist, several lawyers, a security expert, and a psychological counselor who would work with people entering witness protection. Marcus looked up from his laptop. The funeral would have been the hardest part. How do you convince the world someone is dead when they are standing right there? Blackwell pulled out another document, this one stamped with official seals. They used a combination of misdirection and controlled access. The body that was prepared for viewing was never actually shown. The casket remained closed throughout the public memorial. Family members who participated in the funeral were either part of the inner circle who knew the truth or were kept at a distance where they couldn't verify anything specific. It sounds impossible, but when you control every aspect of the environment, you control the narrative. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. His children. What about his children? The room fell silent. Blackwell's expression softened, revealing genuine emotion for the first time. That was the hardest part for Jackson, according to the documentation. The psychological evaluation suggested he was deeply conflicted about leaving them, even temporarily. The plan included provisions for him to eventually reunite with them once they were adults, once they could understand and make their own choices about whether to maintain the secret. Paris, Prince, and Blanket were told versions of the truth as they grew older, gradually, carefully. The implications were staggering. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Michael Jackson was living an ordinary life, or as ordinary as someone with his history could manage. The deathbed confession that had started this investigation had come from a security guard named Thomas Mitchell, one of the few people who'd known the complete truth. Terminally ill and racked with guilt, he'd broken his silence, perhaps believing the world deserved to know, perhaps simply unable to carry the burden alone into death. Marcus closed his laptop with a decisive click. I need to speak with Dr. Chandler. If he orchestrated this, he's the only one who can tell us where Jackson is now. Blackwell shook his head. Chandler died in 2019, a legitimate death from cancer. But before he passed, he left his own sealed testimony with instructions that it be released only if Jackson's disappearance was discovered or if Jackson himself chose to reveal the truth. That testimony is currently in a safe deposit box in Switzerland, accessible only through a series of legal procedures that would take months to navigate. Captain Torres rubbed his temples, a headache clearly forming. This is a legal nightmare. Even if everything Jackson did was technically within the law, there are fraud implications, insurance claims, estate distributions. The Jackson estate has generated hundreds of millions of dollars since 2009. If he's alive, every one of those transactions could be challenged. Sarah turned back to the room. That's not my primary concern right now. My concern is that we have a man who went to extraordinary lengths to escape his life, and we're about to drag him back into the spotlight. The question is, do we have the right to do that? The debate that followed was heated and complex. Sarah argued that Jackson had made his choice and deserved to live whatever life he'd built for himself. Captain Torres countered that the public had a right to know that the deception, however well-intentioned, couldn't simply be swept under the rug. Marcus remained focused on the scientific and investigative aspects, wanting to verify every claim before drawing conclusions. But Harrison Blackwell, the man who'd kept this secret for over a decade, finally spoke up with a revelation that changed everything. There's something else, he said quietly, and the room fell silent. The documentation indicates that Jackson's plan always included an expiration date. He never intended to remain hidden forever. He wanted time, 10 to 15 years, to heal, to find himself outside the persona he created, to discover if he could be happy as someone else. The letter he left included instructions that after a certain period, if he chose not to reveal himself voluntarily, the truth will be disclosed through legal channels. That period ends next year, in 2026. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. The bodyguard's confession wasn't random timing. It was part of the plan. Blackwell nodded. Thomas Mitchell was a failsafe. If Jackson didn't come forward voluntarily by 2025, Mitchell was supposed to trigger the disclosure process. His illness accelerated the timeline, but yes, this was always meant to happen eventually. Michael Jackson didn't want to be forgotten, and he didn't want his children to live with a lie forever. He just needed time away from a world that was crushing him. The room absorbed this information in silence. Finally, Captain Torres spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of command. We need to find him, not to expose him, not yet, but to understand what he wants to do now that the truth is coming out. He deserves to control his own story, at least as much as he still can. Sarah nodded, already thinking through the next steps. The documentation must include clues to his location, his new identity. We need to go through everything systematically. Harrison Blackwell opened his briefcase one more time and removed a final envelope, smaller than the others. This is addressed to whoever discovered the empty tomb. Jackson wrote it himself, anticipating this moment. He handed it to Sarah, who accepted it with trembling hands. She broke the seal and unfolded the single page inside. The handwriting was the same as the earlier letter, but the tone was different, more peaceful, more resolved. It read, "If you have found this, then you have discovered my greatest secret. I am not dead, though part of me died long ago under the weight of fame. I am living a quiet life in a place where no one knows my face or my voice, where I can simply be human. I regret the pain this revelation may cause, but I do not regret my choice. Find me if you must, but know that I have finally found peace, and I pray you will consider carefully whether that peace should be shattered." The address was written at the bottom, simple and direct. The small coastal town of Bandon, Oregon, was a kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where tourists came for the dramatic rock formations and stayed for the welcoming community. Population 3,000, one main street, a handful of cafes, and enough distance from the chaos of modern celebrity culture that a man could truly disappear. Sarah Chen drove through the town slowly, taking in the scenery and wondering how many times Michael Jackson had walked these streets without anyone recognizing the most famous face in music history. Marcus sat beside her, equally quiet, both of them processing what they were about to do. The address led them to a modest house on the outskirts of town, a weathered blue cottage with a garden that showed signs of careful tending. Wind chimes hung from the porch, creating a gentle melody that mixed with the distant sound of ocean waves. A mailbox at the end of the driveway bore the name Martin Chase, and according to their research, Martin was a music teacher at the local high school, a kind man who volunteered at the community center and had lived there for about 14 years. No one suspected that Martin Chase was the most successful entertainer in history. Sarah parked the car and turned to Marcus. Last chance to turn back. He shook his head. We've come this far. Besides, the secret's already out. If we don't talk to him, someone else will find him eventually. They approached the front door, and Sarah noticed her hand was shaking as she rang the doorbell. Footsteps sounded inside, and then the door opened to reveal a man in his late 60s, gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a comfortable sweater. His face bore the marks of age and surgery, but his eyes were unmistakable. Those were Michael Jackson's eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Martin Chase, or Michael Jackson, simply looked at them with an expression that combined resignation and something that might have been relief. "You found me," he said finally, his voice different from the famous falsetto but carrying a familiar quality. "I wondered how long it would take after Thomas passed. He was a good man, carrying that burden. Come in, please. We have a lot to talk about." He stepped aside, and Sarah and Marcus entered a home that was surprisingly normal. Books lined the walls, photographs of students and local scenery covered the mantel, and a piano stood in the corner, sheet music scattered across its surface. They sat in a living room that smelled of coffee and old wood, and the man who'd once commanded stadiums of screaming fans poured them tea with steady hands. "I know why you're here," he began, settling into an armchair that had clearly been his favorite spot for years. "The tomb has been opened, and the world is about to learn that I'm alive. I've been preparing for this conversation for 16 years. Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Jackson, I need you to understand that we're not here to judge you or to immediately expose you. But we need to understand why. We need to hear it from you." Michael set down his cup and looked out the window at the ocean visible in the distance. "I was dying," he said simply. "Not physically, though my health was certainly failing, but spiritually, emotionally, I was being hollowed out from the inside. Every day was a performance, every interaction calculated, every moment documented and analyzed by millions of people I'd never meet. I had no privacy, no peace, no sense of who I was beneath the persona I'd created. The final straw came when I realized my children were growing up in that same fishbowl, unable to have normal childhoods because of who their father was. Marcus spoke carefully. But you were planning a comeback tour, the This Is It concerts. If you were ready to disappear, why commit to 50 shows? Michael smiled sadly. That was part of the exit strategy. Dr. Chandler advised that I needed a plausible reason for a health crisis, something that wouldn't seem suspicious. The pressure of preparing for those shows, the stress, the physical demands on someone my age with my medical history, it created the perfect conditions. When I died of cardiac arrest, brought on by medication for anxiety and insomnia, it fit the narrative everyone expected. Sarah pulled out her notebook. Walk us through what actually happened that day, June 25th, 2009. Michael took a deep breath, and she could see the memories were still difficult. I was at the house on Carrollwood Drive, my rented home in Los Angeles. Everything that morning followed a plan we'd rehearsed dozens of times. Dr. Conrad Murray was there, but he wasn't my physician in the traditional sense. He was part of the team, brought in specifically because of his willingness to participate and his medical credentials. At approximately 11 in the morning, I took a sedative that would slow my heart rate and breathing to levels that would appear critical. He continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The 911 call was real, the paramedics were real, but the chaos of the situation, the panic, it all created enough confusion that what happened at the hospital could be controlled. I was declared dead by doctors who were part of the plan, my body never actually viewed by independent examiners. The death certificate was filed by professionals who understood what they were doing. And then, while the world watched the hospital entrance, I was moved out through a service corridor, sedated, and transported to a private facility where I would recover and begin my transformation. Marcus interrupted. The autopsy report, the toxicology findings, the court case against Dr. Murray, all of that was fabricated. Michael shook his head. The science was real, based on genuine medical data from my years of health problems. Murray's trial was carefully orchestrated. His conviction ensured his silence because speaking the truth would have meant admitting to a conspiracy that would destroy him. He took the full, served his time, and was compensated in ways that don't appear in any public record. He is living comfortably now, I'm told, in a country that doesn't extradite. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. Your funeral, your family's grief, your children crying at your memorial service, that was all real to them. Michael's composure cracked for the first time, his eyes filling with tears. That's a part one struggle with every single day. My mother, my siblings, most of them didn't know. They mourned genuinely because I couldn't risk telling them. The pain I caused, the damage to my relationships, that's the price I paid for my freedom. My children learned the truth gradually, as they grew older, and I've been slowly rebuilding those connections through secure channels. But yes, I let the people I love believe I was dead because the alternative was staying in a life that was killing me. The three of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of the confession hanging in the air. Finally, Sarah asked the question that mattered most. What happens now? The story is going to break, probably within days. The media will descend on this town like locusts. Your life as Martin chases over. Michael nodded, seeming almost peaceful about it. I know. I've had 16 years of normal life, 16 years of teaching music to kids who don't care that I was famous, 16 years of walking on the beach and reading books and sleeping through the night without security guards and paparazzi. It's been enough. Not what I hoped for, not the rest of my life in anonymity, but enough to heal, enough to remember who I was before the world made me into something else. Marcus leaned forward. Do you regret it? Any of it? Michael considered the question carefully. I regret the pain I caused. I regret that my children had to grow up without their father, even though we reconnected. I regret the deception, the elaborate lie that required so many people to compromise their ethics. But do I regret choosing life over the alternative? No. If I'd stayed, I would have died anyway, either from the stress or from something more deliberate. There were forces, people who wanted to control me, exploit me, and when I resisted, they became dangerous. Disappearing wasn't just about peace, it was about survival. Sarah closed her notebook, her detective work complete but her emotional processing just beginning. We need to coordinate your return to public life. It needs to be on your terms as much as possible, a statement, an explanation, something that gives you control of the narrative before the media circus begins. Michael stood and walked to the piano, running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. I've already written it, every word. It's been sitting in a drawer for 10 years, revised and updated as I've had time to think. The world is going to be angry, confused, hurt. I understand that. But maybe, just maybe, some people will understand why I had to do what I did. The press conference was scheduled for 3 days later, giving Michael time to prepare and giving the world time to process a preliminary announcement that had sent shockwaves across every news outlet on the planet. The initial statement had been brief. Michael Jackson is alive. He will explain everything. The internet had exploded into chaos, trending topics dominating every social media platform, conspiracy theorists vindicated, skeptics demanding proof, and millions of fans experiencing emotions they couldn't even name. In Bandon, Oregon, the sleepy coastal town had been transformed overnight into a media encampment, satellite trucks lining every street, reporters standing in front of the blue cottage that had become the most famous house in America. Sarah Chen had coordinated with federal authorities, local police, and private security to ensure Michael's safety during the transition. Death threats had already started pouring in from people who felt betrayed, angry at the deception, or simply disturbed by the resurrection of someone they'd mourned. But there were also messages of support, fans who declared they didn't care about the how or why, just that their idol was alive. The Jackson family had released a statement acknowledging they'd been gradually made aware of the truth over the years and requesting privacy as they navigated this unprecedented situation. The venue chosen for the press conference was deliberately symbolic. The Staples Center in Los Angeles, where Michael had rehearsed for the This Is It concerts that never happened, where his public memorial had been held 16 years earlier. The arena could hold 20,000 people, and every seat had been filled within hours of tickets being released, not for purchase but through a lottery system designed to give ordinary fans a chance to be present for history. Media credentials had been granted to outlets from over 100 countries. The world would be watching. Backstage, Michael Jackson sat in a dressing room that felt hauntingly familiar, surrounded by his children, now adults, who'd flown in to support him. Paris, at 27, held her father's hand, her own fame as a model and actress making her understand the scrutiny he'd been trying to escape. Prince, 29, stood protectively nearby, his business degree and serious demeanor hiding the emotional turmoil he'd experienced growing up believing his father was dead. Bye Guy, formerly known as Blanket, at 24, was a quietist, but his presence spoke volumes about forgiveness and the complexity of family bonds. Harrison Blackwell reviewed the legal implications one final time, ensuring Michael understood that while the deception had been technically legal, thanks to carefully crafted agreements and loopholes, there would still be lawsuits, investigations, and years of legal battles ahead. The Jackson estate would need to be restructured, assets redistributed, and questions about earnings, taxes, and fraud addressed. But Michael seemed unconcerned with the legal complexities, his focus entirely on the statement he would deliver to the world. Sarah and Marcus watched from the wings as the arena filled, the energy electric and volatile. Some fans wore clothing from Michael's various eras, celebrating his music and legacy. Others held signs with messages ranging from welcome home to why did you lie. The diversity of reactions reflected the complexity of what was happening. This wasn't a simple resurrection story. It was a confrontation with questions about fame, mental health, privacy, and the cost of being human in an age that demanded constant access to celebrities. At precisely 8 o'clock Pacific time, the lights in the arena dimmed, and a spotlight hit the stage. Michael Jackson walked out alone, his appearance a shock to those who had only known him through his 2009 persona. He looked his age, 67, his face showing the natural progression of time rather than the surgical alterations he'd been known for. He wore a simple black suit, no glove, no fedora, no costume. He was just a man, and perhaps that was the most radical statement he could make. The crowd's reaction was overwhelming, a mixture of cheers, sobs, and stunned silence. Michael stood at the podium, waiting for the noise to settle, his eyes scanning the arena with an expression that combined gratitude and apprehension. When he finally spoke, His voice was stronger than it had been in the cottage, amplified by the arena's sound system, but also by a resolve that had been building for 16 years. "Thank you for coming," he began, and the simplicity of those words brought fresh tears to many eyes. "I know you have questions, and you deserve answers. What I did in 2009 was the most difficult decision of my life, but it was also a decision that saved my life. I stand before you tonight not to ask for forgiveness, though I hope someday you might offer it, but to explain why I chose to disappear and what I've learned in the years since." He spoke for an hour, his statement weaving together the pressures of childhood fame, the distortion of his image through media scrutiny, the invasions of privacy that had made normal life impossible, and the specific threats that had convinced him his life was in danger. He talked about the toll on his mental health, the feeling of being trapped in a character he created but could no longer control, and the desperate need to discover if there was a person beneath the performer. Michael described his years as Martin Chase with a tenderness that surprised many listeners. He spoke of teaching music to teenagers who'd never heard of the moonwalk, of the joy of anonymity, of simple pleasures like grocery shopping and walking his dog without being mobbed. He acknowledged the pain he'd caused his family, the deception that had required others to compromise their integrity, and the privilege that had made such an elaborate disappearance possible. "Not everyone can escape their circumstances," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had resources most people can't imagine, and I used them to buy something that should be every person's right, the chance to exist without constant judgment and exploitation." The most powerful moment came when he addressed his children directly, turning to where they sat in the front row. "Paris, Prince, by Guy, you deserve better than what I gave you. You deserved a father who was present, who was brave enough to face his fears rather than running from them. I can't give you back those years, but I can promise you that the man standing before you now is a father I should have been all along. I'm not perfect. I'm not a king or an icon. I'm just your dad, and I love you more than any words can express." The arena was silent except for the sound of thousands of people crying, the collective grief and joy of a moment that transcended ordinary human experience. Michael then shifted his tone, addressing the broader implications of his story. "My disappearance raises uncomfortable questions about celebrity culture, about the way we consume famous people as products rather than treating them as human beings. I'm not the first person to be destroyed by fame, and I won't be the last unless we fundamentally change how we think about the relationship between public figures and the public. Privacy isn't a luxury, it's a necessity for mental health and human dignity. What happened to me, the constant surveillance, the obsessive dissection of every choice I made, that shouldn't happen to anyone." He talked about the creative work he'd done in hiding, music written under a pseudonym that had been released without fanfare, charity work done anonymously, and the satisfaction of contributing to the world without the weight of his name attached to everything. He discovered that he could still create, still find meaning and purpose, without the stadium tolls and the magazine covers. "I learned that I am more than what I became famous for," he explained. "The dancing, the singing, the performances that defined my life, they were parts of me but not all of me. Beneath the entertainer was a person who loved simple things, who wanted to be useful, who needed quiet to think and space to breathe." As the speech continued, Michael addressed the practical realities of his return. He wouldn't be performing again. He made clear, his body no longer capable of the physical demands his performances had required even if his spirit were willing. But he would continue to teach, to create music in smaller ways, and to advocate for mental health awareness and the rights of young performers who were being pushed into the same destructive patterns he'd experienced. "If my story accomplishes nothing else," he said, his voice gaining strength, "I hope it starts a conversation about how we protect vulnerable people in the entertainment industry, especially children who have no power to protect themselves." The question and answer session that followed was emotional and raw. A reporter asked about the financial implications, and Michael acknowledged that restitution would be made where legally required, that the estate's earnings would be reviewed and redistributed according to what the courts determined. A fan asked if he'd watch his own funeral and memorial services, and he admitted that he had, that the guilt of seeing his mother's grief had nearly broken him, had almost made him reveal the truth before the plan was complete. Another journalist questioned whether he committed fraud, and his legal team stepped forward to explain the intricate legal framework that had been constructed to ensure everything was technically lawful, even if morally ambiguous. Perhaps the most pointed question came from a music journalist who'd covered Michael's career for decades. You say you needed to disappear to survive, but millions of people mourned you. They cried genuine tears. They felt real loss. How do you justify causing that pain? Michael didn't flinch from the question. I can't justify it, he said simply. I can only explain it. I was faced with a choice between my survival and their grief, and I chose survival. That makes me selfish, perhaps even cruel, but it also makes me human. We all make choices that hurt others when we're desperate enough, when we see no other way forward. I'm not asking you to approve of what I did. I'm asking you to try to understand the desperation that drove it. As the press conference drew to a close, Michael made one final statement that would become the defining quote of his return. For 16 years, I've lived as someone else, and I've learned something profound. Michael Jackson, the performer, the icon, the king of pop, he was a creation, a collaborative work of art built by me, my family, my producers, my fans, and the media. That creation was extraordinary, and I'm grateful for what it gave me and what it gave the world. But that creation also became a prison. Tonight, I'm closing the door on that prison forever. I'm not coming back to be who I was. I'm moving forward as who I've become, and I hope that's enough. The arena erupted in applause, though it was mixed with continued tears and shouts of both support and anger. Michael left the stage with his children beside him, disappearing into the backstage area where Sarah and Marcus waited with security teams ready to escort him to an undisclosed location. The media frenzy that would follow would be unprecedented, but for this moment, Michael Jackson had reclaimed his narrative, had told his truth on his own terms, and had faced the world he'd been hiding from for over a decade and a half. In the days that followed, the reactions were predictably divided. Some fans declared they'd never forgive the deception, that their grief had been real and deserved acknowledgement. Others celebrated his survival, arguing that everyone deserved the right to escape impossible circumstances. Mental health advocates used his story to highlight the devastating effect of fame on psychological well-being. Legal experts debated the implications for state law and fraud statutes. Religious leaders discussed the morality of faking one's death. Philosophers examined questions about identity, authenticity, and the nature of public versus private existence. The Jackson family navigated their own complicated emotions publicly and privately. Janet Jackson released a statement expressing relief that her brother was alive while acknowledging the pain of being excluded from the secret. His mother, Catherine, now 95, met with him privately, their reunion captured by photographers despite attempt at privacy, her tears visible even from a distance. The conversation apparently lasted for hours, and while neither spoke publicly about what was said, family insiders suggested there was forgiveness, complicated and painful but genuine. The legal aftermath was as complex as predicted. Lawsuits were filed by insurance companies, business partners, and even some fans who claimed emotional distress. The IRS launched an investigation into the estate's tax filings. Criminal prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions examined whether charges could be brought for fraud, conspiracy, or falsifying documents. Michael's legal team argued that every action had been taken within the boundaries of law, that no crime had been committed, but the cases would win through courts for years, setting precedents and raising questions that had never been addressed in legal history. Dr. Conrad Murray, released from prison years earlier, gave his first interview since Michael's revelation. He appeared tired but vindicated, explaining that his silence had been bought with threats and payments, that he'd served time for a crime that never happened, and that he had no regrets because the alternative had been Michael's actual death. His testimony provided additional details about the plan, confirming much of what Michael had described and adding layers of complexity to an already intricate story. Sarah Chen closed her final report on the case, her career irrevocably changed by her role in the discovery. She'd been offered book deals, movie options, and media appearances, all of which she'd declined. Her job had been to find the truth, and she'd done that. The rest, the spectacle and the debate and the endless analysis, belonged to the world. Marcus Thompson published his forensic findings in a peer-reviewed journal, his scientific documentation of the empty tomb, and the evidence trail becoming a case study in investigative methodology. Michael Jackson settled into a new life that was neither Martin Chase's anonymity nor Michael Jackson's fame, but something in between. He moved to a secure property in New Mexico, surrounded by family and protected by security, but no longer hiding his identity. He taught music online, his classes attracting students from around the world who wanted to learn from the legend himself. He wrote his memoirs, a 1,000-page tome that became an instant bestseller despite its unflinching examination of his flaws and mistakes. He established a foundation for child performers, using his resources and experience to create protections and support systems that hadn't existed during his own childhood. On the first anniversary of his revelation, Michael returned to the Staples Center for a different kind of event. Not a performance, but a conversation, a moderated discussion about fame, mental health, and the price of being human in the public eye. The arena was full again, the crowd more subdued but equally engaged. When asked what he wanted his legacy to be now, after everything, he thought for a long moment before answering. "I want people to remember the music, of course," he said. "But more than that, I want my story to change how we think about the people we elevate to celebrity status. I want parents to think twice before pushing their children into entertainment. I want fans to remember that their idols are human beings with limits and needs. I want the industry to prioritize health over profit. And I want anyone who's struggling under the weight of expectations, anyone who feels trapped by the person they become, to know that it's possible to choose differently. It's messy and painful and complicated, but survival is always worth the cost." The crowd rose in a standing ovation, and this time there were fewer tears and more smiles, a sense that perhaps something meaningful had come from the chaos and deception. Michael Jackson had died in 2009, but the man who had been trapped inside that persona had survived, and in surviving, he'd given the world a story that would be debated and analyzed for generations. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, but it was honest, raw, and undeniably human. As the lights came up and people began filing out of the arena, Sarah Chen watched from the back row, her work complete but her thoughts still processing everything she'd witnessed. Beside her, Marcus Thompson sat in contemplative silence. They'd uncovered one of the greatest secrets in entertainment history, and in doing so, they'd helped a man reclaim his life and his truth. It wasn't the kind of case that came with tidy resolutions or clear heroes and villains. It was complicated, ethically ambiguous, and profoundly human. "Do you think he made the right choice?" Marcus asked finally, breaking the silence. Sarah considered the question, weighing everything she'd learned against her own values and understanding of justice. "I think he made the only choice he could live with," she replied. "Whether it was right or wrong, that's for history to decide. But he survived, and sometimes survival is enough." They left the arena together, stepping out into a Los Angeles night that was cool and clear. Somewhere in the city, Michael Jackson was returning to his new life, no longer hiding but no longer performing, just existing in the complicated space between who he'd been and who he'd become. The tomb had been opened, the secret revealed, and the world would never be quite the same. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps some secrets, when finally exposed, have the power to change not just individual lives, but the entire conversation about what it means to be human in an age that demands everything from those it claims to love. The story of Michael Jackson's disappearance and return will be told and retold, examined from every angle, used as a cautionary tale and an inspiration, criticized and defended with equal passion. But at its core, it was simply the story of a man who chose to live, who paid an enormous price for that choice, and who hoped that in the end, his truth might help others find their own way out of impossible circumstances. The king of pop had abdicated his throne, but the man behind the crown had finally found peace, and perhaps that was the greatest performance of all.